I believe that the people that wrote that portion of the Bible, they lacked the words and the details to explain the logistical detail that was involved in Moses actually moving people from Egypt, right, to Canaan and to the Promised Land. That's the way they describe my life, because when people see me, right, the first thing, they say, wow, just moved from Africa and boom, look at, where
big
he
time
is.
now.
But they miss all the hard work, just like I believe that, in the story of parting of the Red Sea, they missed all the meetings that Moses had to have with his committees and all the guys that did the logistics, where the children going to be, where they whatever, the orderliness. Being fixated on racism sometimes is a distraction. Yeah. It distracts you from really achieving the kind of goal that you need to achieve. You need to hone in, your
skill set.
Your skill sets, right,
yeah,
to make you better.
Yeah.
Somebody once gave me an analogy that, when you're coming to this society as a black man, it's not a level playing field. You're actually starting from under, right? Yeah. And then,
you have to be exemplary.
Exactly. Yeah. You don't just do things for the sake of doing it. You do it, you go above board and do it with excellence.
Yeah.
And then it becomes, a habit,
yeah,
right? Do the work in a way that, it speaks volume about your ability, your capability. And at the end of the day, you don't have to go take a megaphone and shout that, hey, I'm good at this. Yeah. Let's see it.
Yeah, that is also why this series is so important to me, because like yourself, like your story as an architect, we've had chiropractors, we've had lawyers. I want this series to showcase to Black youth that there's many different avenues. It's not just a cab driver, it's not just an architect, it's not just a lawyer. There's so many different avenues of things that you can do and actually be successful at, right? And it's a lot easier when you see somebody that looks like you in there, right? Doing something and having success.
Have you ever been stereotyped? Had your abilities doubted because of the color of your skin? Judged based on how you look before you even speak? If you have, this series is for you. Welcome to More Than an Athlete, More Than Entertainer.
Okay, we are back with another episode of our More Than an Athlete, More Than Entertainer, Debunking the Stereotype series. And today we have a special guest. So if you notice, we're in a whole different set today. And this set is supposed to kind of emphasize, give you a little bit of a hint as to the person and the profession that we're going to interview today. I'm not going to tell you what it is, but you can see the designs, right? You see the designs, you see the infrastructure that we got going on. So without further ado, I'm not going to keep it from you for too long. We are going to jump right into it. So, Mr. Oboh, please tell the people who you are and what you do.
That's a very difficult task, right? To give. Anyway, my name is Sam Oboh. Mm-hmm. I'm an architect. I live in Edmonton, and I don't know what else you need to know.
No, that is perfect. Mm-hmm. So, I want you to. Where are you from originally?
So I have all these layers of identity, and I feel I belong to everywhere, mm-hmm. right? But I was born in Lagos, in Nigeria.
Okay.
And then my dad worked for a Swiss company, and we moved around a lot. So, at 6, we moved to a place called Maiduguri, very close to Lake Chad, mm-hmm. and then did my, what we'll call primary school or elementary school. Started it there, and then continued my elementary school when we moved to another place called Yola, right, which is a little bit closer to Cameroon, right, and then, from there, after I graduated from high school or secondary school, as we call it, right, moved to Benin area, Benin State University, and then from there, I moved to Zaria, right, where I did my master's program, and then to, South Africa, Durban, Cape Town, and then to Gaborone and Maun, and to Canada. So just to put it, lightly, Edmonton is the longest place I've ever lived in my life. Right, I've been in Edmonton for almost, I think about 22, 23 years now. Yeah. And,
okay.
So.
Okay. So you have a wealth. We have a wealth of. We can't put just one place. We have a wealth of different places that you are from, and I can imagine, right? I can imagine that living in all those different places probably would have shaped you in some way, would have given you some type of perspective on life, and how you carry yourself and operate. Is that true? Is it safe to say that?
Yeah, it gives you a kind of perspective that most people that are sedentary or, that are in one particular environment, right, may not necessarily experience. So even within a country like Nigeria with over 360 ethnic, groups or languages, depending on how you put it, you tend to see the differences and you tend to actually learn and understand. And I think one of the advantage of being able to move around, it means you can make friends easily, quicker and faster. Right? Yep. As opposed to, ruminating on, my friend that was in that. No, life has to move on, right? I mean, I'm saying it now with a hindsight, but I'm not too sure if it was that way, right, per se. But
no, it's funny because I was actually going to ask you, in your journey, if someone is looking at your journey from the outside in, right, what is something that they might miss? And for example, like for me, my dad is a minister, right? My dad is a minister back home. Mm-hmm. And so when I was younger, people might not notice, people might see me and they might say, oh, Akil is really good at connecting with people or talking to people. Mm-hmm. But that actually stems from my dad being a minister back home. And ministers back home, in comparison to ministers here, ministers here usually have like one church or maybe two churches. Mm-hmm. But back home, there's like 6 or 5 that they have all around the island. So I'm constantly being uprooted and moving to a different district where I had to be forced to meet new friends and to connect with new people, which in hindsight, it wasn't always fun because it's a whole level of uncomfortability. I got to go to a new place. I don't know anybody.
But I'm sure you didn't see it as uncomfortable at that time.
At that time, I did a little bit.
If you had a word for it, then you're a spoiled child.
Well, you see, the thing is that
because you just needed to do what you need to do.
I need to do what I need to do, but I'm leaving my friends and I'm going to a new set. I have to make new friends. Sometimes it was uncomfortable, but it was very beneficial to me because it gave me the skill to be able to connect with many different walks of people from different scenarios, different backgrounds, which in hindsight now is very beneficial for me. Yeah. Right? So from the outside looking in, what's something that somebody might miss on your journey here?
I mean, lots. I mean, I think, I don't know if it was my mom or my dad I was saying to, because, just like your dad that is a minister, my parents are actually very religious and grounded in the church. My dad was an elder, my mom is a deaconess, and, and most times when I want to give a lot of analogies, I have to use biblical stories to give the analogy in a way that they've never heard it before, that sometimes they tell me, hey, just shut up, don't say that. So I always give them example of the story of Moses, right? The whole Exodus, right? From, towards the promised land, and all that. And if you remember the story about the Red Sea, right? Parting of the Red Sea, and all that. I have my take on that, right? Okay. That may not necessarily be universal or controversial. I always tell my mom and dad that, oh, listen, I believe that the people that wrote that portion of the Bible, they lacked the words and the details to explain the logistical detail that was involved in Moses actually moving people from right, from wherever they are, from Egypt, right,
to Canaan,
and to the promised land. He said, no, it's a miracle, it's a stick or whatever. I said, yes. That's the way they describe my life, because when people see me, right, the first thing, they say, wow, just moved from Africa and boom, look at, where
big
he
time
is.
now.
But they miss all the hard work, just like I believe that, in the story of parting of the Red Sea, they missed all the meetings that Moses had to have with his committees and all the guys that did the logistics, where the children going to be, where they wherever, the orderliness. Yeah. Absolutely part of, I believe that, yes, that's part of God's miracle, your ability to organize all those things, in a way that, that gives some kind of like result, is still that innate ability that God put in us as human beings. So it's still God's miracle, right? But I think there's some logistical details that you got lost in the story, because it's like, oh, you just, you were born in Africa, appeared in Canada, boom, right? All the late nights, that, you keep, and all the, details and everything that, I mean, very few people actually acknowledge the fact that, when I first came, immigrated to Canada, as usual, right, you want to reach out to, people that were here before you, right? Especially 100%. From a community or people that you know. And virtually, most of the people that I, connected with or that I was introduced to, especially from the community that who are architects, they did not really give me things that are quite encouraging. I still remember one particular one told me that, what is it that you, an African architect, would want to come and design? Every building that needed to be designed, in this place is already done. So it's already designed, it's already done. So what can you add, you from Africa or wherever? I don't realize there's a lesson I learned from, one of my early bosses, when I was working on, a Sheraton Federal Palace Hotel project, in Lagos, in Nigeria, a guy called Kofi Duncan. He told me, I don't know if you can still remember, but he told me, look, it's always very important for you to go to the right people, right? To get the right answer for whatever. It doesn't matter what it is now. By the right people does not necessarily mean people in power. If you need to get a task done, and the gatesman is actually the person that can take you to that next stage that you need to be, then you should be going to the gateman. Don't go to the boss or the supervisor of the gateman, right? If you can avoid it, right? So based on that, I decided that, I think I'm talking to the wrong people. So I went to the Alberta Association of Architects, the Royal Architectural Institute of Canada, to ask them a simple question. What does it take to be a licensed architect, in Alberta, in Canada? And when they told me the requirement, I said, well, is that it? They say, yeah, you have to write 9 exams. It's called the NCAB exam, which is the exam, written in North America, the Americans, and Canadians at that time, because of what they call NAFTA.
So they write the same exam?
Yeah, it's the same exam we used to write, yes.
Okay.
Yeah, so, and then, I got it and I started, studying for it, wrote the exam. And I still remember before I actually wrote my, what they call the architectural registration examination, AREs, I was really fascinated and interested in the whole green building movement. It's called green building, right, here in North America. But for us from Africa, everything we do was green, right? So I was fascinated that, oh my goodness, if you...
And I'm sorry, so green meaning like just fresh, like new, or...
That's the term that's used for sustainable buildings that are designed with certain principles, sustainability, environmentally friendly, kind of things. But I was kind of like fascinated that, oh my goodness, if you have a building with operable window, you get some points. Virtually every building we do back in Africa, we have cross ventilation, which you must have as a result of the weather and all that. So all your windows are operable, right? It now occurred to me that because of over-reliance on technology and constant electricity, and all that, you shut the building, no windows, nothing. You use nature, artificial lights, and all that. So I can understand why that was an incentive to get people to start doing what we've been doing for centuries in Africa. By the time you have, roof garden, right, green roof, you get some points. By the time you have, so it was kind of like interesting. And for me, it was kind of nature. I went, did the exams, and it turns out that, people in the firm I was at that time, a number of them had gone to courses and all that, and it's taken them years and they had not done it. So
before you get there, in the first place, what even led you to architecture in the first place? Was it
serendipity, coincidence, or it was meant to be?
Okay.
It all depends on whatever explanation you want to give. So when I graduated from high school, all right, before I graduated, my dad was building, his own house, the house we're in. So the person that kind of created the blueprints and designed it, I thought he was an architect, but I found out he's just, a technologist or a draftsman and all that. So he did, the design and building, it was built. And I drew the front elevation, right, and painted it and all that. I still remember my dad framed it in his bedroom, right, and all that. And so I said, wow, that's interesting. Maybe, in fact, this guy, Mr. Falabi, I still remember his name, saw it and said, okay, maybe you should come to my, office and do some work. So when I graduated from high school, when I finished my GCE, General Certificate of Education, O-level, there's a waiting period for about 3 months or thereabout for your result to be out. So within that period, I had to go to his office to work, and it's more technical drawings where you're learning how to use the T-square and Z-square, and all that. So I did that, and then of course I applied, to the university, and there were 3 choices. I can't remember which ones are the options, that I chose, but I'm sure medicine was one of it. At that time, going to the military academy was something that was very popular in certain segment. But I never liked the military academy because I went to a military secondary school.
Okay, and so you already experienced some of it.
Yeah, I think I want to experience something else, right? But it was so prestigious being in the military academy.
Yes, okay.
Which is called the NDA, the Nigerian Defense Academy, which is actually similar to Stardust and some of the Royal Academy that you have, in Canada and in the UK. Okay. But it wasn't exciting to me. I wanted to, take on something else. But coincidentally, or serendipity, or name it whatever, when I got, my admission, it was architecture. Okay. So it just became a natural fit, and that was how I got into the university at 16, and I was very excited about about it. Had to go almost 2,000 kilometers. Away from where my parents lived. Yeah.
But did you enjoy that too because you wanted to get some freedom?
No, that was just okay? I was never in bondage.
Right? But it might have been stricter. It might have been stricter back home at home and stuff like that.
No, you have to realize. I think I'm the third child, so we're 6. My parents had 6 kids. Okay. So I was the third child, right? The second son. So I have an elder brother and elder sister. Okay. So they will tell me that my parents are softer, but I didn't think so. So okay. They were softer to the last 3 that came after me, in my opinion. Yeah. Right? But
yeah. But no, I get that. I get that.
But for me, it was just the adventure and the possibility of actually doing something that will enhance your life, your career, right? Yeah. So, it's easy to analyze all those things right now. Don't know what was going through my mind at that time, but you know that you have a task that needed to be done, you get it done. Yeah. No 100%, complaints.
100%. And so when did you realize that architecture could be more than just a drawing? Because in our previous conversation, you said that architecture, you realized that you could, almost paint pictures with architecture, right? So for you, when did you kind of realize that was something, it's not just a drawing, it was more than that for you?
Well, it's always been there.
Okay.
But you may not necessarily have the language or the vocabulary to actually articulate, what you think it is. The experiences and network and connection I've had, right, have enriched, that ability to articulate whatever the phenomenon is. And most significantly, having had the opportunity of doing, a program in communication and technology at the University of Alberta, where I focused on architectural communication, it made it not necessarily easier, it made it accessible to be able to describe, in my own way, what I feel architecture is. And to me, architecture is not necessarily buildings.
Okay.
Those are just products of architecture.
Okay.
Architecture is not necessarily an intangible phenomenon or concept. It's actually something that you're surrounded with, is ubiquitous, is around you every time. It influences virtually everything you do on a daily basis. It's beyond building. So
How so?
what I did, okay, how so? Because it's a medium of communication, is a repository of knowledge.
Okay.
Have you ever been to Rome?
No.
Okay. I'll give an example with Rome, but
Okay.
it's applicable to anywhere in the world.
Okay.
The day you step into Rome, okay, no, let's use a similar example. Kingston,
Okay.
right? You've been to Kingston? Good. You get to Kingston, right? I do not need to have any conversation with you for you to actually understand the mindset that created that environment. So when you get to Rome, for instance, you see all the, history and all that. I don't have to speak Italian to actually understand the mindset that created that. What's communicating that to you principally is the architecture of the environment.
So for example, you mean like, say, like the Colosseum, right? So the
It could be Colosseum, it could be the small details, finer details. It could be whatever it is. All those elements, right, that you put together, they tend to form what I always call the character defining elements. So
Okay.
if you see the Colosseum, even in just few sketches or drawing, oh, that's the Colosseum, right? If you see the Parthenon, right, you will know that that's actually the Parthenon. If you've been to Athens and, Pantheon and all those, classical buildings, you know what it is. Similarly, right, if you look at certain buildings, whether it's in Edmonton or it's in Toronto, where you see the CN Towers, right? Just in a sketch, oh yeah, that's the CN Tower. That's branding, that's recognition. That's an aspect, right?
Okay.
But when I call it a medium of communication, you can use, first and foremost, your building and the architecture that is inherent in that building communicates a lot more than you think. It communicates what your status is in the society. As this guy, are you rich? Are you poor?
Okay.
Right?
Okay. Yeah.
Are you enlightened? Are you conservative? You can tell because it's a reflection of your personality.
That's fair. Based on if you have an open concept house, if you have this, and you might be from.
It may also be something that was happening in your life at the time, right? Where you kind of you can use architecture
based on culture.
Exactly. There's that cultural infusion. There's also, it's also a way to actually express power. There's a reason why in Washington, D.C., for instance, you have the obelisk and then you have the dome, right, on the Capitol, right, building, symbol of power, where you use, at that time, for instance, the obelisk was covered with aluminum, right? At that time, that was one of the most expensive material ever. It was only, kings and queens and princes and princesses that could wear aluminum jewelry. Why was that? Because the process of producing aluminium ornaments was very laborious. So you must be extremely rich.
Yeah.
Until a scientist from Ohio discovered the whole electrolysis, how you separate, the aluminium from the bauxite, the bauxite, right, which is kind of like the mud and the aluminium. So that's, electrolysis, process made it faster, and aluminium now became very ubiquitous.
And more accessible.
And then the question is aluminium more valuable when it was rare, right? Or is more valuable when it's now everywhere? It all depends on the perspective and the lens that you use. So it's kind of like the same thing. Architecture, is a phenomenon that actually influences everybody's lives before anything. Take the legislature, for instance. That's where they debate the laws and everything, that kind of happen. If the architecture of that space is so terrible and they are always in a hurry to want to get out of that place, the kind of laws that they're going to pass there will be rushed and hurriedly, uncooked. But if it's kind of like very comfortable and very suitable for the work that they're doing, the outcome will be different.
Yeah.
It's not any different from when you go to a restaurant or when you go to, an industrial, where if you can use architecture as a tool for economic development.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That has been the case time immemorial in history, everywhere, right? Economic development and architecture is, connected.
So architecture communicates many different things.
Absolutely.
Many different things.
It's a reflection of culture. It's a reflection of power. It's a reflection
prestige.
of
It could be
prestige.
so many different things.
Yes.
Okay. And so taking us back a little bit now. So you came from Africa, right? You came to Edmonton, right? You reach out to some people that your fellow countrymen, and they would have said, you know what, hey, Sam, I don't think that architecture doesn't need you. They don't need you for any of these designs here. We don't need you for that, right?
Well, they were not saying it in that way per se. They were probably just trying to say, hey, look at me. I drive a cab, I make so much money than I will ever make from architecture. Why do you want to waste your time? Yeah. It's more out of care and concern and love to say, hey, I'm giving you an advice. So, and I came up with another set of conclusion that what you become in a society is a function of who introduced you to that society. So if your first introduction to that society is a cab driver, there's a high probability that you may end up being a cab driver too, because he's giving you what he knows. Right?
Yeah.
If whoever is bringing you is a CNA, certified nursing assistant, chances are that you'll probably be one because, hey, this is quick, just go do this exam or go do this wherever it's 3 months days work, and all that.
See, and not to interrupt you, that is also why this series is so important to me, because like yourself, like your story here as an architect, we've had chiropractors, we've had lawyers. I want this series to showcase to Black youth that there's many different avenues. It's not just a cab driver, it's not just an architect, it's not just a lawyer. There's so many different avenues of things that you can do and actually be successful at, right? And it's a lot easier when you see somebody that looks like you in there, right? Doing something and having success, right? So you now came here. So in your journey as an architect, was there ever a time when you had your abilities doubted because of your identity?
Oh, that's constant.
That's constant.
Yeah. I'm not saying it's limited to people from our community, but it's very common. Your competence is always being questioned. Okay. Right? That's the stereotype, if I may use that word, that is very common in the society, in the system.
Yeah, and especially I can assume, for example, for me, when I was younger, I I was involved in athletics, right? And I was a lot bigger and bigger than lots
Bigger
of other
than
kids.
what you are now. Oh my goodness.
So I wasn't. So yeah, I was quite big. Not like fat or anything like that, but just I was a bigger kid, and all the time people always associated athletics with me. They never associate any form of intelligence. It's always that
You're pigeonholed.
I'm pigeonholed. I'm an athlete. That's it. Which I was an athlete at that time. But I also
there are other things.
But there are other things, right? And so lots of times I remember in school when it comes to spelling or different exams, people always a lot of times sometimes I would get left out of certain scenarios because people figured that I couldn't really be able to help in those situations.
Yep.
But I also used that as motivation to be able to excel in my schoolwork. So I excelled and came first and second. So in spite of the stereotype or the doubts of my abilities because of how I might look, I was able to move past that, right? And so same thing for you in architecture. We want to dive a little bit more into that. So we're gonna kind of just break off into our game here.
Okay.
And what I'm gonna get you to do is we're gonna have a bowl here with a couple stereotypes that you would have told me that you would have encountered, right? That you would have encountered at some point in your life, right? What we're gonna do is I'm gonna shake them up. You're going to take one of the stereotypes. You're then going to shoot it into this basket. Now, if you don't make it, that stereotype is not broken. So it's very imperative that you make the shot, But no.
Where am I making the shot from? Because I can make the shot.
You can make the shot. We should have made it a little bit more difficult for you. We made it a little easy
Why?
for you. Because I mean, just life is not easy,
No, life is easy. I'm sorry.
No, so you can make the shot from here, yes.
Yep.
I'm just gonna shake it up here. Actually, we're gonna do something a little bit different after because the stereotypes that you gave me were so I was so interested in them. We're gonna dive a little bit more into each one of the three here, but I'm gonna let you pick first here.
Okay. Do you want the center?
Yeah, and so you're gonna shoot it in, and then after you shoot it in, then we'll open it and then we'll read it. Oh, sorry, you're gonna read it. You're gonna open it and read it.
I'll read it first.
And then you can crumple it up, and then you'll shoot it.
And then you shoot it. Okay.
And then we'll talk about it.
Okay. That's interesting. Okay, treated as a symbol of diversity rather than a respected professional.
Okay.
Valued for representation but not for expertise.
Okay.
Okay?
So you're gonna shoot that in.
Okay. I can do a dunk.
You can. There you go. There you go. Okay. So now we're gonna expand on that. So tell me a little bit about that stereotype and when you would have experienced that.
Yeah. So it's kind of very common, right? Where, I mean, down south, right? They will use the word affirmative action, and where, sometimes people that are not even as good as you, in order to explain their failure, they use your success, right? As a way of explaining their failure to say, oh, he only made it because A, B, C, D, right? Whatever they're explaining. So when things like that happen, right, it's not, unusual. First, I always believe that most people that carry that kind of stereotype, or most people that, try to bring you down or try to nullify, your success, are not necessarily better than you. I've never seen anyone, right, that, brings you down, that is better than you. Most people, right? Yeah. So when that happens, right, I always say to people, it's always an opportunity, right? Where you can lean into that, cultural representation, and actually use it to show that excellence, right? That is in your community.
So turn that maybe that negative or that stereotype into a positive.
Yeah, absolutely. There's no, so yeah, I could be occupying a position. I'm not occupying it because I'm a black person in the society. I occupied it because I have the skills and the expertise, right, to be able to do it. Because I can remember in the interview or in the hiring process where they ever say, "Oh wow, because you're black, we're giving you this position." They make it sound like diversity hire. I don't even know what that means. Absolutely. So that's, for me, I just think that's an explanation that people use to console themselves when they're not able to get it, because there's absolutely nothing called diversity hire in the professional sector. It's either you are a professional that has a responsibility to meet, and it or you don't.
So let me give you a little bit of pushback on that then. So in some instances though, like say you're in a company and it is predominantly white or predominantly another race, right? And they are saying now, hey, well, there's a history or there's a pattern of you not giving opportunities to people of color, right? And then you get hired. Is it a feeling that I guess maybe you're not feeling that way, but feeling that you just got hired just because you're of color? You need to fit that criteria.
So I'll give you an example. I was hired for a very senior position, right, in a very large establishment, one of the largest establishments in Canada.
Okay.
Right? And there were 26 people that competed for that position, and I was hired, right, in that position. Knowing the caliber of people that, I beat in there, I can understand why I was the one that was hired. Right? Many of them are white, and all that, and at the end of the day, they were kind of like surprised, who is this? Right? You do not, I always say, it's a terrible thing for you to use other people's wristwatches to tell your own time.
I like that one.
Right?
Yeah.
You don't know whether they made their own a little bit fast, 5 minutes ahead or 10 minutes ahead or wherever.
I like that
so
one.
you will constantly be unsettled, right? Doing that. But when you're technically competent and you're strategically grounded, right? And you're creatively strong, there's a lot of things, right? That you can do. You're in yourself. You're talking about being able to exhibit excellence, right? In what you do, which is a habit.
Yeah.
And by the time you imbue all that, it's very easy for you to actually understand that you're not just putting on a cloak of confidence. That confidence resides in you. And sometimes you just have to dig deep, right, into it to actually know that, it's there. But you don't even have to be conscious, about some of those things if you focus on the task that, that you need to do.
It's funny because this is pre-knowledge here, so you guys won't know, but I'll fill you in. So, prior to this interview, me and Sam would have had a pre-interview, and we would have discussed some of these things, right? And in the pre-interview, I remember something that you said to me was, a lot of times, yes, stereotypes exist, right? But a lot of the time, we focus so much on a stereotype that we make it become a reality, almost, right? And it's almost in the same thing. You can say, oh, well, they for sure didn't hire me because I'm black. But maybe it's you didn't have the qualifications at that time, right? Which is a very also a new perspective to kind of think it, because sometimes we can always fixate on this is the reason why, right? Because of the color of my skin, because of how I look. When sometimes it might not be the case. Sometimes the stereotypes do exist.
Yeah, those are emotive conclusions, right? When it's almost like when you have to do a debrief, after an incident or after an event, and you want to do a debrief with the team. Rather than do the debriefing in a very methodical manner, right? That is based on principles and performance indicators, we tend to sway towards that emotive side that, I feel that I did not get that job because I was black. And the next question I always ask is, was it every job that you applied for in your country that you got? why is that not racism and this is racism for the same action? I always say racism is not a verb, right? For me, racism can be seen from the data, the trends,
Okay.
right? So if there is a particular position where you know overwhelmingly, right, people in that profession who are actually some of the brightest are from a particular demographics, and every time, right, that position or that kind of position becomes available, the outcome is always skewed towards another type of demographics that represents, kind of like the mainstream or the majority or whatever you want to call it. Then you can start looking at that trend and start looking at, okay, what is it that is creating that outcome when there's this pool of very qualified people right out there and they're not able to make it through. So when you follow that pattern and that trend, right, then you tend to now start seeing, right, some of those systemic things that you have to get rid of. That's not to say that racism is not happening on individual level. It's happening every day, but in different form. It can be subtle. It can be very obvious. It can be aggressive, right? It's there, but it's not a verb. It's not every action that constitutes that. In fact, being fixated on racism sometimes is a distraction. It distracts you from really achieving the kind of goal that you need to achieve. It distracts you. I will say, if you know that, that's going to be a contentious, issue or wherever, you need to hone in, your
skill set,
your skill sets, right, to make you better. Somebody once gave me an analogy that, when you're coming to this society as a black man, it's not a level playing field. You're actually starting from under, right? And then,
you have to be exemplary.
Exactly. So I said, well, that's more like having an analogy as, if you're putting me down under there, then I'm like a seed, right? Where you actually fight the forces of the soil to kind of like sprout up. And by the time you're growing as a tree,
everything after you fight all of that down there, it's easy to grow up there now. See, okay, so I think, and I really wanted to make sure that you brought that up, because I thought that was an important point. Because even when we were talking, I was telling you, no, that's not a thing. But actually having a conversation with you kind of opened my eyes to that sometimes, yes, while stereotypes do exist, a lot of the time, sometimes we're so fixated on it that we're so fixated on, it's because I'm black that they're treating me this way or this way, which sometimes is true, which is sometimes true. But sometimes, because we're so fixated on it, we're doing things that we can see that we're falling into that.
But part of it also is from the individual. Okay. So when somebody comes to tell you, because you're black, why don't you accept it? Yes, I'm black. Right? That should not necessarily be a disadvantage on an individual level, on things that you have control over. Different from when the system is, skewed, right, to work against you, then you have to use a different type of strategy, right, and this is where that collective mindset, right, becomes very instrumental in, shaking, and, dismantling, right, those kind of things. That consistency, persistence, right, becomes very important, right? Consistency is really very important. I don't think it will ever end, whether it's the stereotype or whether it's the, racism or, whatever, it is.
Okay. So I'm gonna just read off these other points that you brought, because I think I really like them, and I want you to dive into them a little bit here. And think about it as a perspective of, many people out here are listening to your story, are going to be listening to your story. And I'm envisioning that there might be some young black female or male designers, not just black, but all the other designers that might be, for this instance, Black youth that might be watching, that might be interested in the field of design, right? And their stereotypes that they might encounter might be different, but these are some common stereotypes that most Black people might encounter. And so I kind of want to hear how you navigate them so that they can kind of give a little bit of perspective on them. Not saying that they have to do it your way, but they have an idea, they can see how someone else is navigating it.
Yep.
And maybe gain something from it. So one of the things that you said here was you've been pigeonholed into culturally focused or community projects. You know, a black architect cannot work or his relevancy doesn't apply to major institutional or high budget projects. So can you expand on that a little bit? So when you mean culturally,
when you're pigeonholed, right? It's not unusual for you to go to corporate organizations where the Black woman is the cleaner, right? You know, so I used to work on a site, you know, in South Africa. Okay. You go to a site, usually the leader of the site, I'm talking about a construction site,
okay,
right? The architect or the engineer has to be a white man, right? The supervisor has to be a colored. Back in South Africa, there is a race called colored, meaning mixed race, right? And then the laborers are the Black people, right? So one of the things that tend to happen, right, in those kind of scenarios is you're pigeonholed, right, even before you know anything. And in fact, I remember on a particular day, because working on, so I was the resident architect on the Botswana Police College, project, which is one of the largest projects in Botswana, you know, at that time.
Okay.
And I was a resident architect, you know, on it, meaning that a lot of the approvals and the contractor, you know, will have to come to get approval. We give the site instructions and all sorts of things. So it's a very strategic role that, you know, requires, you know, that has a lot of responsibilities. And it's almost about 50 kilometers away from downtown. So every day, you know, you commute and you drive. So I still remember on this particular day, this guy, because of how treacherous and dangerous the road is, I learned to drive there on speed limits.
Yes.
Because I had a friend, who passed away, right?
Yes,
you know, that road.
Yeah.
I mean, he had one of the best cars, the Mercedes-Benz, very fast or whatever, but he's a lawyer, passed away. So I tried not to, and I remember on one particular, you know, day, this guy with an expensive car, because I was using my Baki, they call it Baki. Baki is like a pickup. Yeah, truck. Right? You know, so very small, you know, Nissan Baki, you know, that I was using. And this guy was behind me with his expensive car, was very frustrated that you're driving a speed limit. And when he was able to kind of overtake me, he gave me the finger. Yeah. And he made sure that, you know how you're driving and then you stop so that you can see.
He made sure
that you see me, and then I just say, bless you, or whatever.
Yeah.
Of course, you know, I see that a lot.
Yeah.
You know, I got to my office, you know, doing this, and then just a moment later, you know, the site, you know, director from the contractor side, which is, you know, a company called Stocks and Stuff. His name is Carl Dyer. So Carl Dyer is a white guy, right? You know, came to my office. Oh yeah, you know, so Carl Dyer. Who did you work in? You walked in with this same guy that gave me the finger. Of course, I pretended for whatever reason, right? You know, at that moment. So Carl, I mean, this, we need to get the approval from, you know, Mr. Oboh, right? You know, for whoever and all that. And I could sense how uncomfortable he is, but I just pretended as if, right? You know, I didn't even know what happened, or I can't even remember kind of what happened. Now, some things feed into that. Going to that site, any Black person you see on that site is a laborer, right? And all that. So I can see how shocked he was, right? You know, to see that the resident architect that is going to approve what he was in a hurry, right, to get to,
yeah.
happens to be the person that he just gave
Yeah, wow.
the finger to. So much later, of course, he did apologize and said, look, I feel very uncomfortable. After we finished the whole thing, I didn't say anything.
Yeah.
And that silence was just
killing him, right?
killing him. I said, I said, no. So when you're faced with those kind of, first and foremost, I lean into those cultural whatever with pride.
Okay.
Okay. One of the, there's this, poem by Diop, from Senegal, right? Well, it was in Europe, but Senegalese, ancestry. The poem is Africa, my Africa, Africa of proud warriors in ancestral savannah, right? I've never known you, but your blood flows through my vein, your beautiful black blood irrigates the field, right? The whole idea is when you lean into it with pride, you know who you are, right? It doesn't matter how they try to define you, you've defined yourself already. And then you walk, in that, realization that this is who I am.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And not,
what you am. Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. No, I think so. If I'm understanding you correctly, so if someone is perceiving you a certain way because of maybe the way that you look, sometimes you can lean into that, even though once you know that you are more, that, like, say,
and you demonstrate it too. It's not enough for you to know. I always say if you have education and you don't implement, that's just entertainment, right? Okay. So you have to present yourself, in a way that is actually convincing, not just to yourself, but to the people that you're kind of like dealing with. You have to build that confidence in them.
Yeah.
And those comes by way of your technical expertise, right? Your creativity, your ability to solve problems, and not always be waiting for people to actually give you direction on how to. Using your initiative, I believe that your ability to use your initiative is the innate ability that God has given to you. Just like the way I describe it is, the innate ability that God gave to birds is for them to fly. Yeah. Innate ability, that was given to fishes is to swim effortlessly. The innate ability that was given to you is your imagination, your ability to create, your ability to,
100%.
I just think, 100%. That is that way.
Because that's what differentiates us from many other animals.
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly. No, 100%. Okay. And so to dive into this last stereotype that you said here, you said you don't have the competency or authority to be in that position.
That's the perception.
That is the perception.
That, once they kind of say, and I don't think that's exclusively, a black thing, right? It always happens, right? Where people may ascribe, certain qualification or role, right, to a position, and if you don't fit into that mold that they created, right, then they begin to define it differently. When it comes to things like, right, when your competency is being questioned, right, I always say what's very important is, for you not to be defensive, right, about, that, but to actually go into action, right?
Okay.
And what do I mean by, right, going into action?
But wait, what if I am constantly being questioned on my competency? What if I've been questioned on my competency, and then I have proven that I'm a competent architect, I'm a competent doctor, lawyer, whatever it may be.
Yep.
Why do I have to constantly prove that?
There's what they call quiet consistency.
Okay.
You don't have to constantly prove that. Using that word constantly prove that is to yourself, but there's that quiet consistency that you need to display. Okay. And what consistency do you need? That's, 10 technical, expertise, right? That's, you have to be, I tend to call it, that's creatively strong and also strategically grounded.
Okay.
Right?
Okay.
That your technical skills, your know-how, wherever. And when you're prolific in executing, those things, that fits into what I call that quiet consistency.
Okay.
And that becomes, your brand.
Yeah, like your baseline
Yes,
level of
because
operating.
you don't just do things for the sake of doing it. You do it, you go above board and do it with excellence.
Yeah.
And then it becomes, a habit.
Yeah.
Right? So rather than being defensive or using words to describe things, just do the work in a way that it speaks volume about your ability, your capability, and at the end of the day, right, it is what it is. If you you don't have to go take a megaphone and shout that, hey, I'm good at this.
Yeah.
Let's see it.
Yeah.
It's like,
for example, I don't have to, if someone says, oh man, you're not so good at basketball.
Yeah.
I said, okay. But I can go to the court and I can prove that I'm a great basketball player by my play. I don't have to be like, I prove to you, hey, look at this film or look at this clip or look at me playing. I don't have to do that, right? I can just show you through my actions.
Exactly. So it has a lot to do with, they're trying to erode your credibility, right? When they question your competence, and all that. And when you have, that technical competency and you're always very strategic, you do things with reason and you're creative. Not only that, you don't have to stop at that. What I always do also is to find opportunities to actually mentor young people.
Okay.
Right? And have that, interaction and, pass, that knowledge, and before you know it, you have your own.
So speaking of young people, right, and mentorship, for somebody that is watching this that wants to get into this, into architecture and design, right? What advice would you give to them coming into your field?
If they're interested in architecture, they have the desire.
What would be your message? What would be your message to a young black male, black female who's looking to get into?
Just do it.
Just do it.
Just
like the Nike. Just do it.
Don't analyze. If you have the desire, to just do it. But in doing it, right, do it with a bit of strategy and have some what will I call, be dedicated to your craft.
Okay.
That dedication, and then with a little bit of discipline, right?
Yeah.
The sky is the starting point. It's not even your limit.
I like that.
Right?
I like that.
The sky is.
I like that.
Yeah. So dedication is actually very important. It's that dedication that will actually make you to really look at things and look at it, differently.
Okay.
Right? That's how you can discover.
Okay.
Right? Things. That's how you can discover what has always been there, but nobody is actually seeing it the same way. Is that dedication that will actually bring that, out, where you're looking at the same thing and say, oh, wow, this guy has just discovered something new. No, that has always been there, but you just have, a different way of articulating it. You're seeing it and you're seeing it in a different way that is different from everybody else.
Yeah.
And that's what makes it a discovery. So it's that dedication that will get you there. Yeah. But sometimes the dedication is not enough. You need the discipline. If you need to wake up at 4 a.m. in the morning every day, right, and constantly, you remember we talked about that quiet consistency, right? It's discipline.
Blend.
Discipline is the fuel that you need.
It all comes into like a blend,
Yes.
The discipline is needed, dedication is needed, quiet consistency, because like you said, consistency is so important in not just in your career, but in life. Anything that you want to do. If I want to become a better interviewer, I have to do it consistently. I have to maybe watch interviews and have conversations and have to be able to improve. So consistency, dedication, and discipline are key
Those
things.
are some of the key ingredients.
Key ingredients
that you need.
In any profession, to be honest.
In
any profession, but to excel.
So trust me, if I can do it.
Yeah.
You know, anybody can.
do it, yeah.
I actually do not believe in that concept of exceptionalism. That you know, you're different. There's only these few people that can do. Anything can be learned.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
If there is absence of skills, right, in anything, you can learn it. Right.
Yeah.
Some people, it comes natural to them in certain things.
Yeah, they have a
right?
natural fit, yeah.
But for others, you know, they have to actually put in, right,
Time,
you know,
effort,
the work,
effort, yeah.
right? You know, to get things, you know, kind of like, you know, moving. But if you have the desire, which is always very important, that desire is important for you to actually know what you want to do. Wow. Once you have it, you know, just, you know.
There's a saying that says, talent, I can't remember the saying now off the top of my head now. I can't remember the saying off the top of my head.
Okay.
But essentially what it's the framework of it is that there's talent and talent beats hard work beats talent, right? Yeah. But if talent decides to work hard, then it will beat talent. Yeah. But it can be outworked. Someone can work hard. You can have a natural affinity to something. You can be naturally good at something, but it doesn't mean that somebody who's not good at that thing, they cannot work and put in the time, discipline, effort, consistency to become good at that thing.
Yeah.
Right? So like you're saying, there's some people that might have a natural affinity to certain things. Yeah. They might have an eye for design, but it doesn't mean that you cannot develop that with work and like looking on projects and different things to that nature, right?
Yeah.
So within, was there how you define success previously to how you define it now? How has it changed, and what does success look like for you now?
So success is however you define it.
Okay.
But for me, I just try to define success more in terms of movement.
Okay.
Right?
What do you mean movement?
Progress. It can be physical movement, it can be mental movement. So the best analogy I always give is if for whatever reason you're in a rehabilitation trying to recuperate from an injury, right? You know, for instance, the definition of success could be your ability to move from this post to that post on a single day. And when you're able to do that, hey, you know, I achieved whatever. Now, if you have to compare yourself to somebody that is running outside,
you get discouraged.
Then you'll be a failure. So it says if intelligence or success is defined, right, you know, using certain criteria, right? For instance, if you know, success and intelligence is defined by your ability to swim, right? Then the bird will actually be the dumbest creature. Yeah. Right. Because and the fish will be the most intelligent. Yeah. And if the criteria is flying, right, then the fish is the dumbest. Yeah. So you can see, you know, that these things are contexts, right? You know, really matters, and you know, it's important to actually situate things in the right perspective
and to define it for yourself. Like
so you have to define success. There's time, you know, for everything, right? So you can be you can be walking slowly or whatever, but you've already defined that, you know, that's success for you. Somebody else may look at you that, oh, you're being slow, or, you know, whatever, but that your quiet consistency, right? You're making
just like you mentioned earlier, where you can't look at somebody else's watch and try and exactly your time, right? Right. No, 100%. I agree with that. It's everyone's has their own race and their own speed, so you have to figure out what success looks like for you, so that you don't get discouraged by society or any of that. You know what because you're not on the same timeline as everybody else. Everyone has their own path, their own journey to go on. Exactly. So if I want to know a little bit more about the architectural field. So take me in what a typical day looks like for you.
For me, it's different over the years, and depending on the role and responsibilities.
So, but when you're in your most elementary role, I guess, to the role that you are now, what did it kind of look like?
You do everything, right? So you drop. So, you know, in a typical project, architecture has different phases, right? Okay. You know, there's the pre-design, you know, component where There's a lot of engagement with the client, trying to understand, what the client wants, and to create the whole functional programming, right? So that engagement, functional programming, that may require you to do, some gaming, right? Required to bring what they have in them. I come from the school of thought, that as an architect, I'm more or less like a vessel, right? To bring out what the clients, has always had. Yes.
Okay.
And as opposed to, it, you are the expert or whatever. Yeah. That client is the person that will be using that facility for the rest of their life. My contact on that project, at most maybe 2 years, 3 years, but they are left, to deal with virtually everything, that is involved. We used to say in those days in school that when an architect, when a doctor makes a mistake, they can bury the mistake, right? Right? Buried, that mistake. But when an architect makes a mistake, you can't bury it. Maybe you plant tree, in front.
You can block it.
Right. Okay. So there's that aspect, that pre-design, and then you go through the whole design, process, schematic design development, and then working drawings where you kind of create the blueprint, and then construction administration where you're on site, just like, I had to, go to Calgary, right, today to a site to do an inspection, right? So there's all that.
So it goes from pre-design then to the
schematic design development, and working drawings, construction administration, and post-construction. Now, that's on the building side, but architecture is way more than that.
Okay, let me know.
Right? There are other aspects of architecture. I see architecture is almost like a spectrum.
Okay.
Right? Different spectrum for different things, right? So there's that architectural education aspect, right? Where, for instance, I've had the opportunity of being an adjunct, right?
Meaning what?
Adjunct lecturer, meaning like a visiting lecturer in the universities, University of Calgary, University of Toronto, at Yale, right? Or you're a crit, right? Where you, So there's that aspect. There are people that actually practice architecture from research and teaching point of view.
Okay.
Virtually everything that we do. So I was telling you about that functional programming stage. And it involves a lot of research.
Okay.
Right? Because how can you do something better than it was if you've not gone into research? That's how innovation and things get developed, right? And that's something that we do constantly. You're in that research. But there's also that aspect of benchmarking.
Okay.
Right? Benchmarking is a process where you try to set, the standard that you're looking, to create. Okay. So you go to see what's existing, precedents, right, that exist, bad examples of what you should never do, right? It's also a good way of teaching. And good examples of, wow, look at how this has been resolved, and then you improve on it. All those are all aspects of, the research and the initial, the initial aspects.
So there's a heavy research focus within, because you have to obviously study the history of how buildings are made or how they're designed.
Yeah, I'm hoping that, right, you'll have known your history of architecture, right? Fair. For that particular sector that you're doing. But mind you, there's residential, commercial, institutional, cultural, justice facilities, the different sectors.
There are different sectors for each thing.
Yeah, so, performance, so designing, a performance hall, right, is a specialized, area where you deal with acoustics and all sorts of things.
So then for those different sectors, like, the justice for performance, is there a certain benchmark that you would go and kind of
No, there are criteria. I mean, there are things that,
like a staple is like, okay, it has to be this wide for the acoustics.
Those are programs that will be determined based on
The client's needs.
what the client's needs are, or owner project requirements, right, and all that.
Okay.
But I'm talking about the skills and expertise, that is required, right, to do that. You're not just one person, you work with a team.
Okay.
So on any particular project, for instance, you have your sub-consultants that kind of like working with you that you have to coordinate with. So if you're doing, a theater, for instance, yes, there's a structure, right? There's mechanical systems, there's the electrical systems that you have within the building. But there are other specialized, sub aspects of the work, right? That you need to, have. For instance, like the acoustics is very important in a performance theater. Yeah. How do you deal with the acoustic? How do you calculate it? How do you do that? Yeah. In some other, kind of projects, security is actually very important on some, justice facilities, right? For instance, so every project has their own requirements, that, but those are physical projects. But there's also that intangible aspect of architecture also, right? Where you are trying to incorporate culture, for instance, right? Into a building. How do you do that?
Certain design,
the feeling, right? So how the use of colors, the use of light, the use of natural materials, how you blend, those materials, what kind of, how you use sound, right? In the space, what kind of feeling do you want to
atmosphere you trying to create?
Exactly, what kind of atmosphere do you want to create?
Okay, that's very good to know, because I think at least for me, why I'm saying that is because I don't know that much about architecture and the different avenues and different spectrums of things in architecture that you can do, right?
I'm sure you know a lot about architecture. It's just like bread, right? You don't know how it's baked. That's the difference.
Fair.
But when you eat it,
I know. Oh, this looks good, right? But I don't know all that goes into it.
You feel it, exactly. Exactly.
Okay. And so now, kind of shifting a little bit, kind of to the legacy and kind of light here of our portion of our segment here. So if you could speak to your 15-year-old self, 15-year-old Sam, what would you tell him? What message would you give him?
Depending on the context.
So just in general for life, your career, what kind of advice would you give?
I think I actually believe that, everybody, has been given the tools that they need, irrespective of your circumstances.
Okay.
Your ability to look at your circumstances as the opportunity, right? And you convert those circumstances, into the opportunity that you need, right? Is the main thing. So talking to my 15-year-old is, how, to be able to actually convert those opportunities to something, right, meaningful, right, without necessarily being scared of the future, worried about the future, that you have it in you, just be calm, right, cool and collected.
I like that. I think one thing I think is like sometimes a realization that I came to for myself was that a lot of times when things happen, we just look at problems and we focus on the problems. We don't actually look at a solution or look for solutions. And because we're so problem focused, almost like sometimes
that problem is the solution.
How so?
Because give me an example of what you consider a problem.
I say there's a problem where we are not getting, clean water in this building.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it's an opportunity to bring out that skills, that is in you, to look at, how do you, address, the issue of, water. Where is the source, water coming from? Is that water that you're even concerned about? Is that even, right source? It opens another opportunity to look at, something kind of like, different. Somebody else will look at it and say, wow, I can bottle some water and start selling, right, here. Yeah. Right? It's temporary. I can, create a reservoir, right, so that problem in itself is actually what, defines the kind of solutions, right, that different people will do and create back on it.
I see, but the thing that I want to highlight is like, not everyone thinks that way. Somebody might look at it and be like, "Oh, well, I just can't be in this building anymore because there's no water."
That's an option.
So that meant like the mindset. I think the mindset is I'm a very big proponent of mindset. I think mindset is essential for anything that you want to do to be successful. You need to have the right mindset.
Absolutely.
And so, just the way that you look at things, just me looking at that and saying, "Oh, we don't have clean water," I say, "Oh, well." Automatically, well, I knew this building was no good. I'm gonna be the victim type of mentality.
Exactly.
Or I can look at for an opportunity.
I mean, that feels good too, right? To be able to say, "Oh, why should you be in a building that is not functional?" That feels good. But it kind of reminds me, of the saying that it's better to light a candle than to curse the darkness. You can curse the darkness for all you care. It's still not going to bring light. Right? But you're very articulate. Everybody can hail you. Wow, that's true. That's true.
Yeah.
But
doesn't change.
However, if you light a candle and somebody else light a candle, before you know it, one candle can be used to kind of like, light it, and then the entire place is illuminated.
I love that.
Right? So you may think that simple gesture of you lighting a tiny candle is nothing, but that's actually what you need, right? To start solving, right? Just do what you need to do. Right?
No, I actually love that analogy. I love that analogy. That's a great analogy. Just do what you got to do. So, is there anyone in your community or from your culture that would have shaped you, that had a big role in shaping the type of person or man that you became?
Everybody and every person and every land, that I encountered, they've shaped me, right? In a way, starting from my dad, my mom, my parents, shaped me in different ways. My friends, the people I encounter, right? My classmates, everybody has an influence, right? On you. And you learn something, right, from all that, and they tend to shape you, right, in the right direction. You learn a lot of lessons, right, right or wrong, good or bad, right? Yeah. So, and the environment, where I grew up also, had a lot of, influence, right, on how I turned out, having grown up in different, community, different culture, right, makes it, very exciting, right, for me to actually see things from different angles. But with that experience, I have come to a conclusion that human beings are inherently the same, right, the same fear, the same aspiration, same fear, expressed differently, right, based on what you have common, right, in your environment. There's always that saying about, three different schools of thought, right, talking about, environmental determinism, right, how the environment determines, what you become or the outcome, right? So if you live in a desert, for instance, where there's no water, and all that, that environment can shape you, so that you can withstand, you don't have to be thirsty, all the time. That's one way. There's also that aspect of environmental possibilism, right? Meaning that the environment creates all sorts of possibilities, for you to choose from, right? So, wow, it has, this river, it has this fruit, or whatever you choose, whatever. And then there's another school of thought that talks about environmental probabilism. That is not just, the environment, right, that determines or create possibilities. It's kind of like both. So there's that, probabilism, right, that's maybe it's just out of luck, right? Whatever school of thought you belong to, because people actually believe in that, oh, wow, look at you, it's because your dad was rich. That's why you are.
That's why,
And then I'll say, I actually know a lot of, rich people's children that amounted to nothing, right? I came from a very terrible wherever. I was an orphan, blah blah. So I have excuse. Actually, there are a lot of examples of orphans and people that had worse situation than you, and they're billionaires.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And all that.
Yeah.
So
it depends on how you let that influence you, how you
at the end of
what you do, what you do.
Exactly.
Yeah. What you do. There's a story of a jewel thief, and the jewel thief, he had 2 kids. And he got locked up. He got caught. He got locked up, and they interviewed those twins. So he interviewed both of his sons about 20 years later. And the first one, they interviewed him in the act of committing a robbery, right? And he said, "Well, what do you expect? Look at the example that I had for my dad. What did you expect? You know?" And then they went to his son. His son was a big professional lawyer, doing his thing, having lots of success. They asked him they said the same thing, or they interviewed him as well, and he said the same exact thing. Well, look at the example that I had. What did you expect, right? Because I saw that. I don't want to be anything like that, right? So it just comes down to what you decide to do at the end of the day. Whatever environment you come from, whether you come from being poor, whether you come from being rich, it doesn't necessarily matter. It's all about the tools that we all have the innate ability to be able to achieve whatever we put our minds to if we're willing to dedicate time, be consistent, silent consistency, and have discipline to be able to accomplish those things.
Absolutely.
All right.
Absolutely.
So, kind of getting down here now. If you could leave a legacy, well, you know what? I'm gonna change that word for this architectural purposes. If you could leave a blueprint, right? If you could leave a blueprint for how you want to be, I guess, remembered, either for your life, or for your career, for your family, and for your life, what would it be?
Well, is that yearning to actually leave the place better than you met it? And it doesn't matter what it is, right? That's longing to want to make it better, leave it better than you met it. So that could mean all sorts of things. Right, you go to a village, where they do not have a shelter, right, for schools or wherever, what can you do, right, to actually leave something, behind. That aspect of service, being able to serve others, right, can be very rewarding, right? That's the best form of legacy, right, that you can leave behind. I think whenever I'm in any organizations, I've had the opportunity of being in organizations where I've kind of like been the first Black person. My objective is not to be the last Black person, but to create opportunities. And in one of the organizations, for instance, I was, with the hindsight, looking at, some of the hires that I had, in there, being, one of the main, executive, Black person or person of African descent, in there, opened opportunities to even normalize the fact that, oh wow, we know a Black person that is good, so they must be good, right? They're now open, right, to bring in more people, right? That 100%. Fear that,
100%.
So that you have more open doors. You get into a place, you don't shut the door. You open 100%. Doors for others. I think there's also that, poverty mentality in a society, right? And you see it a lot in the debate that goes on, right? Around, opportunities, immigration, just name it. It tends to be that mindset of I'm in now, please shut it, so that others don't destroy it. It's actually an interesting mindset that, it requires a lot of, discussion, right? Because you can actually, create things, in a way you can make things better than to create opportunities for that. Just like people before you creted opportunities for you, because if they had shut the door, you wouldn't have you wouldn't have had the opportunity of being where you are. I think I believe in that. It may be flawed, but that I go by that.
Okay, to leave things better than you met them.
Yes,
and create opportunities.
It's very simple. You go into a washroom, in the plane, and you see that or wherever. Wipe it, clean it up, make it better. for that
The
next person
that's
coming.
Yeah,
You know?
100%.
Yeah.
So you have a nice clean seat. It's not a bunch of pee.
Yeah,
on the
yeah,
seat.
exactly.
Yeah.
But the person coming in enjoying that nice pee wherever
Yeah.
may not know that somebody made an effort, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
So you try to do the
Yeah.
same thing to create a delightful
Efforts.
experience for people coming after you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They said the highest human act is to inspire. And I think that your story and what you're saying can inspire somebody else today, especially when they're interested in architecture, when they're interested in design, when they're interested in another field, right? But just hearing how you would have navigated different stereotypes, how you're still navigating them, and how you're still being able to be successful, right? Last two questions I have for you here is, what is being more than an athlete, more than entertainer mean to you? And in the context of being more than an athlete, being more than an athlete, being more than an entertainer, to me means that I actually don't think that you can just be an athlete. I don't think it is beneficial, or I don't think you can be just an athlete or entertainer. I think it is fundamentally key for you to be more than just an athlete and entertainer. I think even the athletes that are successful, LeBron James, Steph Curry, they're not just athletes. That might be the thing that they excel at the most and that they do for their living, but they're still businessmen. Athletics can only last you for a certain period of time. You're gonna have to live a life after that as well too.
I think that's the trap that the society, has created in trying to define, right, people. It goes back to what we talked about, that tendency to want to pigeonhole, people.
Yeah.
So if you make tea and you make the best tea or wherever, they tend to pigeonhole you.
You just make a tea maker now, yeah.
You're just a tea maker.
They want you to
But
branch out.
within you that, you're multi-talented, you have other abilities and other creativity. It's your responsibility to show it. Others will. I mean, one of the examples I always tell people from our community, when I first got hired in my first job here, because I wasn't licensed, so I wasn't really hired as an architect. I was just hired as an architectural consultant or a designer. But when I was given tasks to do, I was given task of the technologist, and all that. I had to go out of my way to do the task, find opportunities to do the task of an architect. And how did I do that? One of my, bosses, right, who was always, frustrated, with certain, things, simple things like proposal writing. And one day, I just did some of those things for him, right? He didn't ask me to do it. Say, oh, you did this? Wow. The next thing is, that one. And then I did others, right? So it's your responsibility to actually demonstrate, what you can do, right? To help if you're able to make somebody's day lighter and better, right? So be it. You being of service to somebody is actually going to be beneficial, right? To you. You are the greatest beneficiary, right? All that. You're putting out, energy and putting in a lot of effort in trying to make things better, right? For somebody else, right? Comes back to you, right? It goes the same way, right? Where people in our community, they get upset when they're disrespected, and they tend to have that passive aggressive, response, right, towards the situation. And I always say, when you have that passive aggressive response, that defines you, because when somebody else who is in a position of authority is actually evaluating quietly and looking for people, all they see is you grumbling. They don't know that you have better ability because you have that passive aggressive. Oh, they paid me $10, so I'll just give them $10
work.
When it's time, right, to start considering people for $1,000 kind of work, all they're saying is
that $10 work,
your $10 work,
effort,
right, and all that. So at the end of the day, right, passive aggressive, response, to life is shooting yourself in the foot. every opportunity that you have, right, is an opportunity for you to actually showcase what you're able to do, and keep raising the bar.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
No, I was gonna ask you what's your final message to the people, but I think that's a good final message. I think that's a good final message. Well, that concludes our episode of More Than an Athlete, More Than an Entertainer, Debunking the Stereotype. We want to thank you so much, Ms. Oboh, for coming and sharing your story. I think, like I said, highest human act is to inspire, and I think somebody will be inspired today. I definitely learned some more about the field of architecture. I also learned about some of the stereotypes and how you kind of navigate it. And I think, just like I was saying from before our conversation, you kind of changed my mindset and my perspective on a couple of things too, which I appreciate. And hopefully the same goes for somebody else out there who's watching. So without further ado, that's it for us, guys. But we will see you again next episode.